All right. Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Ramit Billen. I am the CEO and owner of Women of Influence Plus. Welcome to our first LinkedIn Live, where we have a very special guest that will be joining us today, Laura Williams, who is an HR lawyer and is the founder and principal of Williams HR Law, LLP. Laura, thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ramit. Looking forward to this discussion.
Me too. It's always such a pleasure to chat with you. And as you know, today we are going to be focusing on tall poppy syndrome. So I am going to start off by talking about what tall poppy syndrome is, share a few of the statistics that came out of our study. And then Laura, I've got 3 specific questions for you as it relates to workplace discrimination and harassment. And for the audience that is joining us today, we are also going to encourage you to ask your questions. We do have a moderator for the chat. So if you have a question related to what it is that we're talking about, pop it in there and we are going to try to get to as many as possible in the 30 minutes that we have together. So let's get right into it. Now, tall poppy syndrome is a term that was popularized in Australia, and it refers to the fact that you are attacked, resented, ostracized because of your success or achievements. Now, we did an international survey earlier this year at Women of Influence Plus, where we had 4,710 respondents across 103 countries. Now, what the data shows is that 86.8% of respondents had shared that they experienced tall poppy syndrome. Now, it manifests in different ways. It could be that your achievement was dismissed, or it could have been downplayed. Others may be taking credit for your work, or when you received that promotion, you may have been left out, ignored, or silenced, even after you received that success or achievement. We also know that it has an impact on the individual. So respondents said that they actually experienced lower self-confidence. And Laura, I don't know about you, but that sounds a little counterintuitive, because if you achieve something, it should be a boost to our self-confidence. But respondents said no, right? They experienced lower self-confidence. We also know that respondents experienced imposter syndrome. It had a negative impact on their mental health, and there was an increase in stress and burnout. So it does have an impact on the individual, and the time that we're going to spend together is we're actually going to talk about the impact it also has on the organization. So interestingly, 75% of respondents said that experiencing tall poppy syndrome impacted their productivity, and these are your high achievers, high performers, and 60.5% said that they believed that they would be penalized if they were perceived as ambitious at work. So what does that mean for organizations? We have top talent in our organizations that actually may not be showing their ambition because they perceive that they're going to be penalized for it. So we know TPS is a problem. And now, Laura, we've got a lot of questions for you. I'm going to limit myself to 3. Audience, we want to hear from you. We want this to be interactive. Please pop in any questions you have in the chat function. The first one I want to ask you, Laura, is related to where the line is drawn between comments that are made in passing and workplace harassment and discrimination. Because I get a lot of questions around, well, what's the difference between TPS and harassment and discrimination? Over to you.
Well, first, again, thank you so much for having me, because I really truly believe that this is such an important topic. Oftentimes we see, and I think profoundly in the post-pandemic workplace, employers, employees, just organizations generally are grappling with conduct issues. And to me, just in terms of my lens, and just to be clear, my lens is as an employment lawyer, but also as an investigator and as an organizational reviewer. So I really get to see, unfortunately, the dirty underbelly of workplace conduct and how organizational objectives, wellness, sense of fulfillment, all of the things that are necessary parts of work and of what organizations bring in terms of what they bring in terms of their products and their services or offerings, how that can be, again, derailed. So really the fine line is, it's fine, but not so fine, because oftentimes what people don't realize is that when it comes to harassment or discrimination, which oftentimes are the outputs of tall poppy syndrome type behaviors, that it doesn't require a pattern or a continuous course of conduct. And that's sometimes misunderstood, because inherent in the definition of, or expressed in the definition of harassment in most health and safety legislation, which is where harassment protections often live across jurisdictions in Canada and in many other jurisdictions worldwide. And the reason being is the harassment, the fallout, the psychological impact is seen as a hazard. It could be from one single incident. But oftentimes what we think about harassment type behaviors or discrimination type behaviors that are protected under human rights legislation. It could be just, the one incident such as a slur. It could be something overt that somebody is saying something like, we think that it's the overt behaviors like, you're yelling at somebody or demeaning somebody. But what has really evolved is a reality where a lot of harassment and where harassment and discrimination intersect, discriminatory harassment resides is around the subtle type of behaviors. And subtle behaviors are oftentimes what they really strike at is someone's sense of significance or worthiness. And that's what cuts across all of us as human beings, is we all have the need to feel significant. So the undermining of individuals by saying things such as, you think you're too good now that you've got this promotion, or trying to hold people back because, let's say, others feel threatened. These types of manifestations of these types of behaviors, which is tall poppy syndrome, also can definitely constitute harassment and discrimination in the workplace.
Laura, I'm like secretly trying to take notes, but I'm just going to openly take notes because every time I talk to you, I learn something new. So there's so much in what you just said. So it doesn't have to be a pattern. It can be a single instance. That's very important to note. The second piece, which is fascinating, is what you described, that worthiness piece. Yes. And in the open-ended responses, there were so many quotes where respondents said, I felt worthless. Yeah. Or my CFO told me I wasn't worth it. And this word worth kept coming up. And so that's really interesting, that connection between worthiness and tall poppy syndrome. So much to unpack there, but it doesn't have to be a pattern. It can be an instance. And the other thing I'll share as it relates to the survey is that many respondents said that, it occurred directly, so overtly to their face, or indirectly, where they heard about something happening behind their back, or then it came up and they were told about it. So we do know that it manifests in so many different ways. So thank you for sharing that. Now, we asked a number of questions, way too much that we can get into in 30 minutes. But one of the big ones is we asked respondents, how do we fix this? How do we go about managing? How do we go about mitigating this? Because it is a silent systemic syndrome. Now, respondents shared the number one thing was like build awareness, talk about it. I didn't know this had a name. Many people felt alone that this was only happening to them. So that awareness piece was important. Now, the other piece that respondents shared was accountability. And we know that it's important to hold people accountable. So my question is going to relate to that. But what was fascinating in the responses was that respondents said, hold them accountable regardless of their position title. Because people were experiencing it from the CEO or their supervisor or their client or their vendor. So it's not that only a specific group is going to be penalized if they are engaging in tall poppy syndrome. Everyone needs to be held accountable. But easier said than done, as you know. So my question to you is, how can we hold people accountable, and how can organizations work with both parties? The person that's being cut down and the person or people that are doing the cutting. How do organizations go about this?
Well, your question touches on so many elements of what needs to happen within a workplace. And the respondents in the survey, they hit on one of the key things, which is education. I think that we often believe that others should intuitively understand what's offensive or what crosses the line, and that's not the case, right? So oftentimes, because we might be responding, or individuals might be responding out of a scarcity mindset of, if somebody else advances within an organization, or if I perceive them as gaining an advantage, I'm going to lose something, it's almost like an instinctive response to cut them down, to shear them. So there is, on the organization's part, I think the best and most effective thing to do is through education to preempt, to really let individuals know that, look, these are some of the sources and manifestations of behaviors. This is what's appropriate within the workplace context. This is what's inappropriate. And then you have to always lead and underscore with the why and the harm that ultimately will ensue if these behaviors are allowed to perpetuate. So you touched on something in your question that's a phenomenon within a workplace, and that is, yes, sometimes organizations are willing to call certain people, call them out on their behaviors, but then sometimes they'll turn a blind eye to others. And this phenomenon also has a name, which is the rock star bully. So somebody that is believed to have significant bottom line impact. It could be a vendor or a supplier. It could be a colleague. It could be a leader. And it's felt that, well, we just have to let them misbehave because we don't want to rein them in because they are valuable. And usually it's valuable from an economic or monetary perspective to the business. And that is something that is, it really hits at not only the heart of an organization's culture, could have reputational fallout, but it has direct harm on those that have to endure that type of conduct, and often leads to escalations that look like harassment complaints, discrimination complaints, and rightfully so, because there's just this pervasive sense of psychological unsafety, if you will, or lack of psychological safety within the workplace environment. So accountability is essentially drawing a hard line on this is what's acceptable, this is what's unacceptable, being intentional in being fulsome as best as possible. You can never comprehensively do so, but really educating the organization, laying out in policies what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, clearly with examples. Because again, let's not take for granted that people are going to understand that, this type of behavior may be offensive, may be unwelcome, may be hurtful, may be harmful. And then the piece that's so important is to make sure that the consequences are clear of this conduct, and that these consequences also will be consistently applied. And then the other piece, just a really last quick piece, is where there is a derailment, where there is an incident, organizations have to make sure that they turn their minds to remediating. Right? So how can we restore? How can we make people whole who have been harmed? How can we ensure that relationships are repaired, or that we exit bad actors that aren't capable of rehabilitation? So those are a few things that need to happen to hold people accountable. But if I were to just sum it up, is to hold people accountable where they perpetuate these behaviors. Don't condone it. Make sure it's understood across the workplace that everyone, all individuals, from employees or workers, supervisors, managers, to the employer globally, that based on how even the health and safety framework works as an internal responsibility system, everyone plays a part in mitigating the risks as it relates to behaviors that could constitute tall poppy syndrome. And also everyone has a duty to ensure that these hazards are mitigated.
Laura, there's so much I want to say. That brilliant. You started off by talking about the scarcity mindset, and we saw that in our survey where we asked respondents, why do you think that tall poppy syndrome occurs? Many respondents said, oh, the other person is jealous or envious, or there's gender stereotypes, sexism, racism, ageism, as well as that scarcity mindset where the pie's only this big, and oh, wait, if she gets a piece of that pie, then there's less pie for me. And so that can motivate that action or that reaction when someone succeeds. However, the pie isn't fixed, right? You also talked about the rock star bully, which I am so glad that you mentioned, because when we asked our respondents, and these are tall poppies, these are high achievers, the impact that it had on them and in the workplace. Well, if you keep that rock star bully there, yes, it might have a benefit economically, but you're also losing high performers. You're losing your high achievers, which are more expensive to replace and more difficult to replace. I had this one quote in our open-ended responses where the individual herself did not experience tall poppy syndrome, but she shared that I saw this happen to someone else and I left before they could cut me down. So you're not just losing, you can keep the rockstar bully all you want, but you're losing a lot of employees. And to your point, it's absolutely having an impact on the culture. And I am assuming, and it showed in our data, that the trust is broken.
Yes.
Right? It's broken. And when I feel as if you're going to do harm to me, whether that's physically, mentally, emotionally, or to my career, my walls are going to come up. Yep. And if I believe that, you're going to lose that currency of interaction with me. And that results in people working in silos, people not exchanging information or sharing ideas and thoughts. And there's no psychological safety there.
Yes.
So much more I want to say, but I want to get to my next question because I know we've got questions in the chat. I do want to encourage those that are listening today, please pop your questions in there. We are moderating the chat. I will go to as many as I can before our time is up. So my final question to you, Laura, is this. We did ask our respondents whether or not they shared their experience related to tall poppy syndrome in their workplace. Those who answered, yes, I did share my experience, we then asked them, were they encouraged to take action? Now, of our respondents that did share it, only 20.4%, so 1/5, were encouraged to take action. Majority of them were not encouraged to do anything except keep it to themselves. And in our open-ended respondents, many said that I was blamed for it, or I was the one that was encouraged to leave, or I was told that I was being emotional. Now, a theme that came out of our survey was that many respondents felt that their HR departments have failed them. Why do you think that this is the case, and what can organizations do when people do share that they're experiencing this?
Okay, lots to unpack there.
Yes.
But let me start with this. Oftentimes, tall poppy syndrome types misconduct, I'll call it, it manifests, as I mentioned before, as subtle behaviors, right? When it comes to discrimination or discriminatory harassment, oftentimes these days, what we're seeing coming forward as complaints relates to subtle types of discrimination or subtle types of harassment or discriminatory harassment, very broadly referred to as microaggressions, micro-invalidations, right? So when you have something that's very subtle as a micro-invalidation, so a comment that oftentimes, sometimes, sometimes, the perpetrator of the misconduct may not even intend to offend. It may, but it lands as at best a backhanded compliment, right? But the reality is it's not about intent or intention, it's about impact. And that's what organizations have to understand. Another thing, across most jurisdictions when it comes to harassment, organizations have to appreciate that it's not a complaints-driven exercise when it comes to escalations. Once you're aware of an incident, you're obliged, there are positive obligations to act. And oftentimes that action includes complaint intake, escalating by way of investigation, and making sure that you come to findings and any decisions to address what is essentially the risk within the workplace. So really when it comes to down to it, if an individual is encouraged to just sweep it under the carpet, the organization is exposing themselves to liability. And oftentimes from an HR perspective, they may sometimes inadvertently rebuff or discourage complaint escalation, because oftentimes policy frameworks within organizations don't expressly set out what microaggression type behaviors look like, or micro-invalidations, which are, somebody may say, look, I don't appreciate that comment. And, maybe kind of response may be, oh, you can't take a joke, or I was just kidding, or really it's not that serious. And sometimes HR might respond to someone bringing a complaint forward in the same manner by dismissing it or being dismissive of it, saying it's not that serious. But oftentimes, again, it's because there's not education, even within the HR department or amongst an HR team, as to what constitutes harassment or discriminatory harassment that looks like a microaggression or a micro-invalidation. So the main kind of thing, again, always goes back to education. And it goes back to also making sure that beyond education, that there's a capture, an articulation in writing of what constitutes, harassment, discrimination, and getting a little more granular, right? getting into the subtle discrimination, the types of behaviors, the tall poppy syndrome types of behaviors that aren't caught when you have a list of unacceptable behaviors that only focus on overt expressions of offensive type conduct, right? So really with HR, there's that piece. There's also the piece where HR may feel compromised because the tall poppy syndrome might be perpetrated by a senior leader. And that has to be contemplated within the policy itself. So there might have to be some bypass from HR. Sometimes, let's say if an organization is governed by a board, it may be easy to escalate to a board of directors. Sometimes you may have to use an external agency to do complaints intake. But wherever there could be a perception of bias, or where it may be that an employee, including HR, may feel compromised because they may be facing triaging a complaint of a direct report, that bypass should be inherent in the policy itself. And then finally, I'll just say, back to education, senior leaders have to understand what the exposure is and what the fallout will be when it comes from a liability perspective if they allow or condone or somehow suppress a valid complaint of subtle discrimination or subtle harassment. And again, the source could be tall poppy syndrome, right? Those types of behaviors. So, it is multifaceted, but again, HR has to be equipped. The policies have to be clear. The end round or bypass, that path has to be articulated and clearly communicated within the workplace. And the exposures to liability have to be doubled down on so that there is this impetus or it's compelling to take action when these types of complaints come forward, either as a complaint or as an incident.
I have so much to ask you and so much to share. I love that you keep going back to the education piece. And we do have some questions from the audience. And again, if you've got some questions, post them in the chat function. We will get to as many as we can. So you went back to education. And when we had asked respondents, what can we do to manage or mitigate this? Or how do we fix this problem? So I mentioned, they said awareness, accountability. They talked about transparency. So making sure, like, as you are talking about policies, making sure it's transparent. How are you promoting people? All of that needs to be transparent. And I think when we do create policies, yes, it's about articulating them. I love your example that you shared earlier where we can include examples there and then also acting on them. That helps to create that transparency piece. Respondents also said zero tolerance, right? Like zero tolerance. It just cannot happen in the organization. And our policy should reflect that. And to your education comment, they talked about training around emotional intelligence, so many different types of training that can be implemented, but again, building that awareness around it. I love that you talked about microaggressions. Now, this is actually my first time hearing micro invalidation. I hadn't heard that before. And what you're really talking about is that downplaying, right? We're downplaying.
Gaslighting. Right?
Gaslighting. Yes. It's like, oh, no, it's not as big as you think it is. It's when we make those comments and when we talk about microaggressions, you're absolutely right. Someone whose intent is not in a bad place, they may make a comment that they don't realize is offensive, right? Oh, that's right. They were looking for a woman to fill that role, where we've now just downplayed that individual's qualifications. So this invalidation piece, thank you for bringing that up, because you can kind of talk to someone and say, hey, you know what, that wasn't okay. But then what happens when they downplay that? And oftentimes that is the case. It's like, oh, no, I didn't mean it that way. But hold on a second, that individual did interpret it that way.
Right.
So thank you about that. And I love that you said it's not about intent, it's about impact.
Indeed.
Right? Your intention can be in the best place, but what is the impact of that? And we need to build awareness. Now, oftentimes people say it starts at the top, it starts with leadership. And I agree with that, but I also push back on that, because what you were referring to earlier is it starts with every single one of us. We are all responsible in terms of our interactions, how we act, react, and interact.
Can I jump in for 1 second?
Please, yes,
just
absolutely.
I feel that that's something I'd love to underscore, because that is something practically that organizations can really seize. And that is just, harkening back to, I mentioned the internal responsibility system, which is what health and safety legislation is pretty much founded on. And that means that all workplace parties have responsibilities and duties to mitigate hazards. I mentioned that. what you can do and what this allows organizations to institute is putting some accountability on the bystander, right? So that complacency or fear or lack of courage that certain individuals feel when they're witnessing something, but they feel they can't say something about it. It's so important to embolden bystanders by just educating across the workplace that we all have responsibilities, legal responsibilities in many jurisdictions. And so if you see something, you have the obligation to bring it forward, and not only equip them to bring it forward by just saying bring it forward, but giving them very kind of tangible examples and practical mechanisms to bring things forward as a bystander. And that can help to tamp down some of these unacceptable behaviors within the workplace.
And Laura, I'm going to have to bring you back, because then we get into this idea of psychological safety. Do people feel safe to actually bring that forward? And that's a whole different conversation. I do want to get to some audience questions. This has been phenomenal. Our first question: how can we build meaningful community to tackle this issue worldwide to create movement in the same way professionals united over occupational safety or ESG these days? So how can we do this around tall poppy syndrome and, broadly speaking, workplace harassment and discrimination?
I think, you're part of the movement, the wave to do this, that bringing it forward, giving it a name. That's such an important thing. I had that feeling too. And, back in, I think the first time that you invited me to contribute thoughts around harassment and discrimination, I believe was 2017. And you've been relentless in bringing this forward. And that's how, enabled by what we're doing now, where we can access one another through digital platforms, where we can get the word out there. But I think education internally within workplace environments, letting leaders know. I know that you somewhat said that, and I agree with you, it's not only from the top down, but right across the organization. I find that it's so impactful to preempt behaviors, particularly when we deal with the preempting the scarcity mindset, because nobody really wants to have a scarcity mindset. But they don't know that they have it, and that's what's perpetuating the behaviors. So I think really two things, and this may make me sound woo-woo, but really promoting the concept of an abundance mindset. We elevate everyone's game by reducing, minimizing, and eradicating these behaviors, right? There is opportunity for everyone. We can't have, the possibilities of everything within the life that we have is beyond our comprehension. That's why we behave in certain ways. And the second thing is grace. Right? We have to have grace with one another. That's a word I'm trying to revive. I'm like, I say it every opportunity I get. And that is just being grace for ourselves. We happen to be in a mental health crisis where a lot of people feel strained. We're in a post-pandemic workplace that has a lot of different complexities. So we have to have grace for ourselves and grace for each other. And that really is a way to just keep spreading the word and becoming more accepting and understanding why we have to respond to and address certain unacceptable behaviors.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to add to what it is that you've said. And we say that it starts at the top with leadership. And you and I are talking about how it starts with each and every single one of us in the workplace. I'm going to add to that and say also outside of the workplace. So we did pose one question where we asked respondents, have you experienced this outside of the workplace? Half of respondents said yes. We then posed that question, who did you experience tall poppy syndrome from outside of the workplace? Laura, 50%, half of respondents who had experienced it outside said from their friends.
Yeah, family and friends. Yes.
Friends, siblings. And so it's how we act, react, interact with each other in the workplace as well as out of the workplace. That's how we create the movement, is we are responsible for ourselves. And I think that's so important. And Laura, we are so thankful to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are right at the 11:30 mark. I learned so much when I spend time with you. We adore you here at the Women of Influence Plus community. Thank you for spending time. If you're not connected with Laura on LinkedIn, I highly recommend you connect with her. Thank you, thank you. We hope you enjoyed our first LinkedIn Live today. Our next one is coming up, and we are going to be focusing on harnessing the impact of personal branding. So have a wonderful start to the week, everyone, and see you again very, very soon. Thank you so much for joining today. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, Laura.
Bye, Ramit. Thanks again.
Thank you.